In the final hours before the guillotine, Marie Antoinette wasn't treated as a queen. She was handled like property. Every command, every touch, every whisper in that cold cell carried the weight of humiliation. They stripped away not just her crown, but her dignity, piece by piece. This isn't the story of her death, it's the story of what they secretly did to her before it. Would you have survived the same torment, or surrendered long before the blade fell? If you want to uncover the darkest truths history tried to hide, subscribe before we begin. Before we uncover what truly happened inside those stone walls, tell me, have you subscribed to the channel yet? You won't want to miss what comes next. Before the dawn broke over Versailles, the sound of thunder wasn't from the sky, it was the mob. Their boots shattered marble, their voices echoing through golden halls that once hosted laughter and music. Marie Antoinette stood frozen as the world she built on silks and chandeliers collapsed into screams. She had known fear before, the whispers of betrayal, the sharp stares of courtiers. But this was different. This was the end of illusion. Her jewels, her gowns, her gilded mirrors, none could protect her now. As the palace gates fell, so did her title. The queen who once commanded nations was reduced to a trembling figure in a plain dress. They dragged her through corridors still scented with perfume and roses, now stained with sweat and gunpowder. Every step away from the throne was a step deeper into the hatred of the people who once bowed before her. When they reached her carriage, one soldier spat the words that burned deeper than any wound. "No more queen, just Antoinette." The crowd roared, not with victory but with vengeance. As the wheels turned toward Paris, her reflection in the window showed not a ruler, but a prisoner of her own history. In Paris, her image became a weapon. Pamphlets flooded the streets, each one more grotesque than the last. They painted her as a temptress, a conspirator, a monster draped in lace. Men who once wrote poetry in her honour now sketched her face beside devils and serpents. The revolution needed an enemy, and she was perfect, beautiful, foreign, and silent. Silence that others filled with lies. They said she plotted against the poor. They said she spent gold while children starved. They said she seduced power itself. Inside her darkened cell, Marie could hear the laughter of the guards echoing beyond the walls. They read those pamphlets aloud, their words dripping with mockery, reminding her that even her body was no longer her own. It belonged to their stories, their anger, their revenge. At night she would trace the outline of her ring finger, where once the royal seal had rested. Now it was bare, just like her name. In the eyes of the world, she was no longer Marie Antoinette, Queen of France. She was Madame Deficit, the woman blamed for everything that went wrong, every insult carved deeper into her mind. She had once been adored for her elegance, now that same grace was called arrogance. She had once been celebrated for her charm, now it was called manipulation. The same beauty they once worshipped became proof of her guilt. By the time she reached the Conciergerie, she no longer wept. The building stood like a tomb over the river Seine, cold, grey, silent. Inside there were no courtiers, no candles, no music, just the smell of damp stone and the sound of dripping water. Her cell was small, barely large enough to lie down. The floor was rough, the straw damp. A single candle flickered weakly against the wall, and for the first time in her life she felt invisible. Guards were posted at all hours. She was never left alone, even to sleep. Each movement was recorded, each word overheard. There was no privacy, no rest, no warmth. It wasn't the blade she feared. It was the slow erosion of her soul. They said the Conciergerie was the antechamber to death. Every prisoner who entered eventually met the guillotine. Marie knew it. She could feel it in the air, thick, heavy, inevitable. But she held herself straight, even in her rags. Not for pride, but for memory. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Outside her window, the city cheered for freedom. Inside, a woman waited, stripped of power, name, and comfort, but still clinging to the faintest ember of dignity. And as the candle burned low, she whispered to the darkness, "They may take my life, but not my story." If a crown can turn into a curse overnight, would you still crave power, knowing how quickly love turns to hate? The Conciergerie did not welcome its prisoners, it devoured them. Its walls were thick with moisture, the air heavy with mould and despair. Rats ran freely across the straw floors, gnawing at crumbs that once fell from royal hands. For Marie Antoinette, this was no longer a palace of marble and mirrors. It was a grave that had not yet been sealed. Her food came cold, often stale, carried in tin bowls by guards who refused to look her in the eyes. Once she had feasted on gold plates. Now she counted the number of flies in her soup. She had no mirror, no jewels, no fabric softer than the rough wool that scratched her skin. Each morning began with the same metallic clang of keys. The door opened. The guards entered. They stood in silence, watching her wake. Their gaze was not of duty, but of inspection, as if the former queen was now a creature in a cage, something to be studied, not pitied. Even her simplest acts, eating, sleeping, praying, became public performances under watchful eyes. She was never alone. The sound of boots pacing beyond her cell became the rhythm of her life, a constant reminder that her body was no longer her own. The once grand rhythm of court life, music, perfume, whispers, had been replaced by dripping water, metal chains, and muffled sobs from other cells. The revolution had stripped her of title, comfort, and identity. But here, in the shadows of the Conciergerie, it aimed to strip away her very self. Among the guards there were women, some drawn by duty, others by resentment. They were chosen carefully, not for kindness, but for control. Their orders were clear: keep the queen under watch at every moment and report anything she said or did. They sat in her cell during the day, pretending to clean or mend, but their eyes never left her. Every sigh was recorded. Every whispered prayer was noted. They were not allowed to speak to her, yet they studied her like shadows who breathed. Some of them had once admired her, had even imitated her fashions. Now they relished her downfall. They mocked her silence, her posture, the way she tried to keep her back straight despite exhaustion. They wanted to see her lose that composure, to see the queen collapse into the prisoner. Occasionally a younger guard would glance away, unable to bear it, a flicker of compassion quickly extinguished by fear of punishment. No one disobeyed the orders. Marie knew this and said little. Still, she tried to hold on to her last traces of dignity. She would fold her ragged blanket neatly each morning, adjust her torn sleeves, and whisper the same words before sleep. "I am still me, for as long as I breathe." But her voice was fading. The shadows seemed to grow thicker every night, and the guards' silent stares reminded her that even her endurance was being used against her. Proof, they said, that she was cold, proud, unrepentant. The revolution wanted her broken, not dead yet, just hollowed out. Days blurred into nights. Marie Antoinette no longer knew what time it was. The only clock was the candle burning in her cell, melting faster with each passing day. Sleep rarely came. When it did, it brought nightmares. The cries of her children, the roar of the mob, the sound of her husband's final breath. Each dream ended the same way. She stood on the scaffold, faceless voices chanting below, until the blade fell and she woke in the dark. She began to speak to herself softly, almost in a whisper. Not madness, but a desperate act to hear a human voice in the silence. Sometimes she thought she heard responses, echoes from the stone, or perhaps memories that refused to die. Guilt was her most merciless companion. She thought of the people who starved while she dined in Versailles. She thought of the children she could no longer hold. For every cruelty done to her, her mind found a reason to blame herself. The guards saw her decline. To them, it was victory. To her, it was surrender to something beyond pain, the numbness that comes when fear becomes too familiar to feel. By the end of that month, Marie's reflection in the tiny window glass barely resembled a queen. Her hair had turned white. Her skin, once praised for its radiance, had faded to the colour of ash. Yet, in her eyes, a fragile light still glimmered. The last piece of herself the revolution could not reach. She no longer prayed for freedom, only for peace. If they took away your voice, your comfort, your name, how long would you fight to remember who you once were? The chamber was hidden deep within the Conciergerie, beyond the reach of daylight. Its walls were lined with stone slick from centuries of damp air, and in the centre stood a single wooden chair, the seat of truth, as the guards called it. When they brought Marie Antoinette into that room, she understood immediately that truth had no place here. The revolution had already written her guilt. The interrogation was merely a performance. The men who awaited her did not see a woman. They saw a symbol of everything they hated: monarchy, wealth, pride, and luxury. Their eyes glittered with something between triumph and contempt. On the table before them lay papers filled with accusations written long before her arrival. "Confess," one of them said. "Make it easy for yourself." Her voice, calm but weary, replied, "Confess to what?" They began the first round of questions. Endless, circular, designed to confuse. They asked her about secret letters, about stolen gold, about alliances she had never made. They twisted her words, repeating them until meaning vanished. Each answer brought another question. Each silence was called arrogance. Each tremor of emotion was called deceit. Hours turned into days. They never struck her, but the pressure was relentless. The weight of 10 voices accusing, the scrape of pens recording her every breath. When she faltered, they smiled. When she stood tall, they pressed harder. By the end of each session, she would return to her cell with trembling hands, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. It wasn't the pain that broke her. It was the endless demand that she prove she was human to men who had already decided she wasn't. As the interrogations continued, the questions grew darker. The revolution needed not only to destroy her name, but to disgrace it forever. They accused her of conspiring with enemies of France, of sending messages hidden in loaves of bread, of planning to poison the nation. But it was not enough. The crowd demanded more spectacle, more scandal. So they invented it. They accused her of unnatural acts, of moral corruption, of sins unspoken in polite company. The courtrooms whispered it first, then shouted it. The pamphlets printed it in bold ink. And finally it became official testimony, a grotesque fiction paraded as justice. The interrogators asked questions meant to humiliate, not to reveal truth. They stripped words of meaning and turned them into weapons. Each accusation was designed not to convict her of crime, but to destroy her dignity in front of the world. Marie sat through it all, her eyes fixed on the table before her. She did not cry. She did not plead. Only when they spoke of her children, dragging their names into lies, did her composure crack. She raised her head, her voice trembling not with fear but fury. "I appeal to every mother who hears me," she said. "You know what they accuse me of. You know it is false." Even some of her enemies shifted uneasily. For a brief moment the room went silent, the weight of her words cutting through the air like a blade sharper than any guillotine. But the silence did not last. The revolutionaries had no room for mercy. They needed a monster to justify their vengeance, and they chose her. After that day, Marie was no longer interrogated in the same way. The questions ended, but the punishment did not. They left her alone for longer periods, letting the silence itself become a torment. The candles burned shorter, the meals grew smaller. Her hair, now completely white, fell across her shoulders as she sat by the small window, staring at the grey river beyond. She no longer spoke to the guards. She had realized that every word she gave them became another weapon used against her. So she chose silence, the only power left to her. That silence unsettled them more than any defiance could. They wanted to see her beg, to see her break. Instead, she withdrew into herself, preserving the last shred of control they could not take. Her thoughts. Some nights she imagined her husband standing beside her, his voice calm and steady, reminding her that their children would one day know the truth. Other nights, she imagined the people of France realizing what they had done. Too late. The revolution believed they had taken everything from her. But as the days passed, Marie's quietness turned into something unbreakable. Not pride, not arrogance, but peace. When they came for her final confession, she looked at them without fear. "You can write whatever you wish," she said softly. "You've already written my death." And in that moment, surrounded by her enemies, stripped of all power, she stood taller than any of them. If you were accused of crimes you never committed, would you fight until the end, or fall silent like Marie Antoinette, knowing silence might be your only truth? The final night was silent. No questions, no footsteps outside her door, no voices from the hall, only the slow ticking of a watch that no longer belonged to her. Marie Antoinette sat awake long after midnight, her hands clasped around a worn piece of fabric torn from her dress, the last remnant of colour in a world of grey. She had been told she would be executed at dawn. The guards did not need to say when. She could feel it in the air. Her candle burned low, painting her face in pale gold. For the first time, she looked at her reflection in the small shard of glass left on the table. The woman staring back was almost unrecognisable. Hollow eyes, white hair, a neck once adorned with diamonds now wrapped in rags. Yet there was a calmness, the stillness of someone who had already died in every way but one. When morning came, the door opened without ceremony. A soldier stepped in, holding a folded paper, the official order. Marie Antoinette, former Queen of France, he read aloud. The words struck her like a blade. Former. Even her name now belonged to history. She stood, straightened her back and whispered, "I am ready." The guard did not respond. He turned away, signalling the others. As they entered, she knew the moment had arrived when they would strip the last piece of her life away. Not her body, but her dignity. Before her execution, the Queen was ordered to change her clothes. The request was not made out of respect. It was ritualized humiliation. They brought her a plain white gown, coarse and simple, the colour chosen not for purity but for irony. White, the colour of innocence, forced upon a woman declared guilty. She began to undress in silence. The room was cold, her hands trembling as she removed the faded dress she had worn through months of imprisonment. The guards watched, their faces expressionless, though their eyes betrayed curiosity, contempt, and something darker, the satisfaction of witnessing the fall of royalty. One of them laughed quietly, another coughed to hide it. Marie did not speak. She only lifted the gown and placed it over her shoulders, her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. For the first time she dressed not as a queen, not even as a prisoner, but as a woman facing her end with what little grace remained. They cut her hair next. Her once golden curls fell to the floor, a symbol of vanity and youth now discarded like waste. Each lock was taken as proof that the crown had finally been severed from the woman beneath it. When they were finished, she looked at them, not with hatred but pity. "You cannot shame me," she said softly. "You only reveal yourselves." Her words unsettled them. The laughter stopped. For a moment the room felt smaller, the silence heavier. Then they bound her hands and led her outside. The streets of Paris were already crowded. Word had spread that the Widow Capelle, as they now called her, would face the blade that morning. Thousands gathered to see her final fall. They placed her in a rough wooden cart, the same one used for thieves, murderers, and traitors. The wheels creaked as it rolled forward through the cobblestones. Once she had travelled these streets surrounded by soldiers in gleaming armour, crowds cheering her name. Now she rode through jeers and laughter, the people shouting insults and curses. Some threw mud, others waved banners mocking her last words from trial. She kept her eyes forward, not out of pride, but resolve. Every insult only strengthened her calm. The sky above was pale blue, a cruelly beautiful day for death. A priest sat beside her, whispering prayers, but she barely listened. Her mind drifted between memory and silence, her children's laughter, the gardens of Versailles, the first time she saw France. All of it fading now, replaced by the rhythmic sound of wheels and the crowd's roar. When the cart finally stopped at the foot of the scaffold, she stepped down carefully, her bound hands making each movement deliberate. The executioner offered his hand to steady her. She looked at him briefly and said, "Pardon me, sir. I didn't mean to." It was her last act, an apology for stepping on the foot of the man who would kill her. Even in her final moment she carried the manners of a queen. As the blade was raised, the crowd held its breath. And when it fell, sharp, swift, final, a single cheer erupted, followed by silence. The revolution had taken her head, but not her dignity. When everything, name, pride, and freedom, is taken from you, what remains that they can never destroy? The blade fell, and for a brief moment, Paris stood still. Then the cheering began, wild, thunderous, unrestrained. The same voices that once sang praises to their queen now roared at her death. The executioner held up her severed head before the crowd. They shouted, "Long live the Republic!" as if the fall of one woman could wash away centuries of suffering. Children clapped, vendors sold wine, soldiers smiled. It was a performance, a nation proving to itself that it no longer feared crowns. But beneath the noise, a strange quiet lingered. Some in the crowd looked away. A few whispered prayers. Others simply stared, unsure if what they witnessed was justice or madness. The Queen's body was carried away, stripped of all ceremony. No anthem, no burial robe, no mourning veil. Just a nameless grave in the Madeleine Cemetery, where lime would soon eat through bone and silk alike. By nightfall, her name was erased from official papers. Marie Antoinette no longer existed. In her place, the record read only, "The widow Capet, executed for crimes against the nation." Yet even in death she remained a mirror to France, reflecting its beauty, cruelty and hunger for both freedom and revenge. Before her execution, the Queen was ordered to change her clothes. The request was not made out of respect. It was ritualized humiliation. They brought her a plain white gown, coarse and simple, the colour chosen not for purity but for irony. White, the colour of innocence, forced upon a woman declared guilty. She began to undress in silence. The room was cold, her hands trembling as she removed the faded dress she had worn through months of imprisonment. The guards watched, their faces expressionless, though their eyes betrayed curiosity, contempt, and something darker, the satisfaction of witnessing the fall of royalty. One of them laughed quietly, another coughed to hide it. Marie did not speak. She only lifted the gown and placed it over her shoulders, her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. For the first time she dressed not as a queen, not even as a prisoner, but as a woman facing her end with what little grace remained. They cut her hair next. Her once golden curls fell to the floor, a symbol of vanity and youth now discarded like waste. Each lock was taken as proof that the crown had finally been severed from the woman beneath it. When they were finished, she looked at them, not with hatred but pity. "You cannot shame me," she said softly. "You only reveal yourselves." Her words unsettled them. The laughter stopped. For a moment the room felt smaller, the silence heavier. Then they bound her hands and led her outside. Centuries later, historians and artists began to look beyond the legend. They found fragments, letters she'd written to her children, notes from prison, small acts of kindness remembered by servants and strangers. In those words, a different woman emerged, one not of extravagance or malice, but of loneliness, fear, and courage. She was flawed, yes, but human. Modern scholars began to see her as a victim of two revolutions, one political, one personal. The first took her crown, the second destroyed her identity. Between them, a real woman vanished, one who had once been a child bride, a mother, a wife, and finally, a prisoner. Today, her image still divides opinions. To some, she remains the cold queen who said, "Let them eat cake." To others, she's a tragic figure crushed beneath the weight of history. But in the silence left after her death, in the stillness of her final words, something deeper remains, a warning. Power can raise a person to the heavens and cast them down in a heartbeat, and the crowd that cheers for your rise will be the same to celebrate your fall. Marie Antoinette's story is not only about royalty or revolution. It is about the fragility of perception, the danger of myth, and how easily truth can be rewritten by those who shout the loudest. Her voice may have been silenced on the scaffold, but her story still whispers through time, reminding us that even in death, memory is a battlefield. When history chooses who to glorify and who to condemn, how do you decide whose truth to believe?